When you need a lawyer, how do you find the right one? Contact the Chicago Bar Association.
Whether you've been injured or need a will prepared, whether you're buying a home or starting a business, having the right lawyer is essential. The Chicago Bar Association have lawyers who practice in most areas of law and speak a variety of languages.
Don't leave it to chance. Get a referral to a screened, experienced lawyer. Visit chicagobar.org or call 312-554-2001. The Chicago Bar Association. Se habla español.
Welcome back to You in the Law. Today we will be talking about fighting against sex abuse, representing survivors, and the Robert Anderson case. This will be a roundtable question and answer discussion about how to recognize and combat sexual abuse, the challenges of representing survivors in those claims, the Robert Anderson case against the University of Michigan, and important legislation that has allowed survivors to seek justice. Before we go any further, we just want to warn the audience, we're going to be talking about sexual abuse and sexual assault today, which are very sensitive and challenging topics that impact quite a few people. So if those topics are sensitive to you, just be aware that that's what we're going to be discussing today. Today, we are extremely lucky to be joined by two incredibly talented practitioners who have been tireless advocates on behalf of survivors of sexual abuse. With us today out of Denver is Parker Stinar, who is a partner and personal injury attorney at Wahlberg, Woodruff, Nimmo, and Sloan LLP, which is based out of Denver. Parker's experience relevant today includes representing survivors of sexual abuse, including survivors of the assault by Larry Nassar and against USA Gymnastics. Parker has served as one of the lead attorneys for the $490 million settlement against the University of Michigan on behalf of the survivors of Dr. Robert Anderson's abuse. Parker has also been involved in legislative efforts in both Colorado and Michigan to protect the rights of survivors of abuse. Martin Gould I call him Marty Gould, is a partner at Romanucci and Blandon, who has also been a tireless advocate for survivors and has represented hundreds of survivors of sexual abuse in claims across the country, ranging from cases involving survivors of the Jeffrey Epstein abuse, clergy abuse survivors, to claims against the Boy Scouts of America and private and public institutions. Parker and Marty, welcome and thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Max.
Thanks for having us.
Let's get started. Parker, can you tell us, just so the audience understands what we're talking about today, what do we mean when we say sexual abuse?
Absolutely. So most states adopt the criminal definitions of sexual abuse. And when we think of sexual abuse, I think sometimes as a society, we think about rape, and we tend to think about a male raping a female. But sexual abuse, and we've seen it sadly, civilly, most recently, expands well beyond that. It can be anything from unnecessary and unwanted touching, grooming, often done under the guise of medical treatment. Marty will talk more about it, but certainly in our religious organizations and entities, but essentially unwanted touching for someone's sexual gratification is typically how states would define civilly sexual abuse.
Thanks for explaining that. So then to jump to the main case that brings us here today, can you talk a little bit about the maybe I shouldn't call him doctor, but the Robert Anderson case against University of Michigan, what that's about, and when you get into it, why it took so many years for folks to come forward to talk about it?
Sure. So Dr. Anderson was a physician at the University of Michigan from the 1960s up until the early 2000s. And he worked in sports medicine, working with the football team for the vast majority of his career. And he was regarded as the top athletic physician at the University of Michigan, working with the football team and other sports programs. And during his numerous decade tenure at the University of Michigan, under the guise of medical treatment, he sexually abused thousands of students and members of the public, all done under the guise of medical treatment for the most part. There are some individuals that, back in the Vietnam War days, he would require sexual gratification or events to write them favorable notes to get them out of the Vietnam War draft. But he was there for a number of decades. And during the period of time that he was there, the University of Michigan received numerous complaints about him. Students coming forward, athletes coming forward, reporting his unnecessary or weird behavior, and it was ignored at the highest level. What I mean by under the guise of medical treatment is an athlete may come to Dr. Anderson with a sore elbow, and all of a sudden, this 17-year-old is getting a testicular rectal exam. And as we know now, and we certainly knew then, for a young individual, there's no therapeutic or diagnostic purpose for giving a rectal exam, especially by a sports physician when you're coming in for an unrelated medical issue. And this went on for decades. And so many of these young individuals were forced to see Dr. Anderson. If you're a 17 or 18-year-old kid coming from small town America to play football at the University of Michigan, a lot of times this is the first time that you're getting serious, sophisticated medical treatment by a University of Michigan doctor. And your coaches would tell you that you have to see him. You're no longer able to see your childhood physician. You're required to see Dr. A. And as a young individual that has the pressure of being a D1 athlete at an elite program, and Marty certainly was as well, the pressure of competing and wanting to start and wanting to impress your coaches and your teammates, and you don't want to be the individual that's complaining. And unfortunately, you go in and you have a very uncomfortable and weird experience with this doctor, but you want to get back on the field. And for so many of these individuals, they didn't know what was going on, was sexual assault. When a University of Michigan doctor is telling you that he has to perform a rectal exam, you're going to believe him. And for a lot of these individuals, they were unaware that they were sexually assaulted until 2020. So these individuals went on living their lives a lot with different traumas that they didn't appreciate back to those events. And then all of a sudden in 2020, when they realized that they were assaulted, it's changed their lives.
That's a really terrible thing to have happened. It's great there are attorneys working on it now and advocating for these folks. Marty, to switch to you for a moment, including this case, and other than the obvious that these cases involve often abusers or who are in positions of power doing horrible and sexually exploitative things to the plaintiffs, who are the folks who've survived it, what are some of the challenges you have to overcome in these cases as you represent these people?
Sure. So, one of the first challenges is really getting these people to feel comfortable enough to come forward. So for some of these survivors, they have been thinking about this for for decades. I had a client I met with yesterday who said he was going to take it to the grave, but then he heard about other survivors coming forward, and it gave him that courage to come forward and believe that he would be believed. Because a lot of these perpetrators are people that were in positions of authority and respect, and it's not easy to come forward and say that this priest who was a leader in the community had abused you. And is anybody ever going to believe me if I tell them? So having the survivor kind of feel comfortable enough to come forward and tell their story. And then the second part to that is the statute of limitations. So, unfortunately, in a lot of states, there's archaic laws regarding child sexual abuse claims, where you may have, 2 years from the time you turned 18 to pursue a case. But, for many reasons, many of these survivors don't come forward until their late 40s or early 50s. Feelings of humiliation, embarrassment, feelings like they wouldn't be believed. So up until recently, the public didn't know about Dr. Anderson's long history of sexually abusing students. So these are types of abuse that people don't talk about amongst each other. And only until recently, when it came to light that not only did he abuse hundreds of people, possibly thousands of people, but that the school knew about it and was covering it up and looking the other way, and he left and then he came back. And that's important too, because as it relates to the statute of limitations issues in the states where there isn't a revival window, which is essentially a statute where the state legislature said, enough is enough. We have to do right by these survivors. And they created a window, 1 year, 2 years. In California, it's 3 years, where survivors of child sexual abuse can come forward and file their claims and seek justice in the civil courts, regardless of when the abuse happened, even if the statute of limitations was expired. But in some states where you don't have that type of legislation, and there's many states out there, there are case law that's developed surrounding fraudulent concealment. This whole idea that these institutions were concealing the abuse, not letting the public know about it, covering it up, and that prevented people from knowing that they had claims against these institutions for their own culpability. And all those reasons are why, the biggest fight that happens in these cases is the statute of limitations. And I know Parker's going to talk a little bit about how that played a role in the Dr. Anderson cases. That's kind of how I came to meet Parker, as he was leading that litigation. I represent a number of survivors who are now, physicians and other professionals. And Parker got me up to speed on where we were in that case and all the efforts that were being made to change the laws in Michigan.
So before we jump to those efforts to change those laws, Parker, are there any other challenges you want to share with the audience about these sorts of cases and representing these sorts of survivors?
Yeah, and kind of to pick up on one of the things that Marty discussed, and I represent both male and female survivors of sexual abuse, and I know Marty does as well. And it's unique with every survivor of sexual abuse. Every survivor has their own individual story. But one of the things that I commonly see with male survivors, and especially for University of Michigan, where the vast majority of these survivors are former D1 athletes, D1 football players at the University of Michigan, is as a society, we have different opinions on male survivors of sexual abuse, let alone big, strong athletes. And sadly, throughout the course of this case, I would hear from friends or just chatter of, wow, you are a 6'3", 250-pound football player and you allowed yourself to be sexually abused. And there's this sad stigma that we as attorneys and as a society need to get rid of and dismiss those feelings or those thoughts and believe survivors and look out for them and appreciate that male and female individuals can be sexually abused. It can be done under the guise of medical treatment, and that it's okay for male survivors to come forward. So that was one of the things that Marty talked about with the difficulty is getting these individuals to feel comfortable coming forward. And that was one of the challenges for the Michigan case. Another challenge that I think we see for survivors of abuse is if you're older and the abuse took place decades ago. Well, how is someone going to believe me? Well, now I'm in my 40s and 50s and maybe I feel comfortable coming forward, but what laws are there that will protect me when the abuse took place decades ago or the abuser is deceased? And as Marty touched down on, more and more states are opening up windows as we understand the science behind what survivors of sexual abuse go through, the average age that a child sex abuse survivor actually, if they ever do come forward, what age they actually come forward. So to your question about the University of Michigan case or some of the challenges we see, certainly the statute of limitations issue, and we'll discuss that more, but just the comfort or comforting these survivors, letting them know they aren't alone and it's okay for them to come forward and encouraging them to come forward, because for many survivors, especially the abuse took place decades ago, they haven't gotten the types of helps that are available out there to help them move forward with their life and maybe put together some of the pieces that have been broken because of the traumas they've sustained.
Well, and having not litigated these cases like you guys have, that makes me think, they've been living their whole lives with some psychic injury that's hurting them in many different ways. They may not even realize, right? Or they may have suppressed it, and getting them to be able to come forward and confront that must be challenging.
And that's something that with the University of Michigan case that we saw so often is you have these individuals that, in society's view are as manly as it gets. You played for a Rose Bowl championship team or a national championship team, and you're supposed to be this tough, manly individual. And when you're 21 years old, if this doctor is giving you an examination and you get an erection, you might not understand the anatomy of why that took place or what happened. And even if that individual isn't homosexual, they always look back at that event in their life thinking, why did I get an erection with a male doctor? And a lot of times because of that, regardless if they knew they were sexually abused or not, that event has caused trauma, whether it's trust for medical providers, whether it's intimacy issues, whether it's trust of authority individuals. And it sadly led to destructive behavior for a number of individuals, regardless if they were able to think I was sexually abused.
So I think one of you did mention this before, but building on what Parker said, Marty, are there differences in how you approach it or how the cases progress in representing male versus female survivors?
The reality is that there is a different perception when it comes to male survivors of sexual abuse. And that's particularly the case if it's a female perpetrator. So, I represented a high school student. He was 16 years old at a private boarding school, sexually abused by his teacher for a year. There's a huge power differential. She was, 35 years older than him. And there was an immediate response from the defense counsel during our discussions as to the value of the case and how statistically male survivors of sexual abuse with a female perpetrator would get significantly less compensation. And this was a student who probably did 50 therapy sessions after this, had intimacy issues, had all sorts of problems, post-traumatic stress disorder. And, it was to hear somebody say that he should be treated worse, or that his injury wasn't as bad as if he had been, male on male or a female abused by a male teacher, is just not based on any type of science. There's no medical science that will say that a male victim of sexual abuse somehow has a less of an injury. And I think the dialogue has to change, and people have to have a greater awareness of the fact that the injuries are the same, the trauma can be the same. And if anything, it just makes it a lot more difficult for male survivors to come forward. I think the time has the atmosphere we're in now and the people's awareness of the systemic abuse that occurred in a lot of these institutions has begun to change the culture and the perception. And I think it's very important for there to be greater awareness of what had happened in the past. It used to be blasphemy to accuse a priest of sexually abusing you. And there was many, many cases where parents found out and they came forward back in the 80s or 90s or even the early 2000s, and the church swept it under the rug. Maybe they paid them some small sum in a confidential settlement. And then the next person would come forward and they'd say, oh, this is the first time it's ever happened. This is a one-off. I can't believe it. And then just move the priest to a different parish. And because of that, feelings that you'd never be believed. And the public perception was a priest would never do that, or this doctor who's the head of this department would never do that, or this Boy Scout leader who's a leader in the community would never do that, has intimidated people from ever coming forward. And I think now with people like Parker who are raising awareness in Michigan about the Dr. Anderson cases, or just the media in general, starting with the Boston Globe story back in 2003, and raising awareness about the systemic abuse that started a snowball effect across the world. We're moving to a place now where legislatures are starting to recognize the importance of raising awareness, changing the laws, and the science behind and the reasons behind why people don't come forward until their 40s and 50s.
Something that jumps out to me about what you've both been talking about is the power dynamic that exists here beyond age. It's the prestige quite often in the community, or the perceived prestige of the abuser, whether they're a physician, a clergyman, or otherwise Boy Scout leader. Something else that comes to mind, Jerry Sandusky's an old football coach who had this charity and did this to a lot of children. And that using that prestige basically to fend off any accusations and use these institutions that they've often built around themselves, not only to protect themselves, but also to supply them with more people who end up getting abused. I don't know if either of you has a quick thought on that.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that disgusts me as I handle more and more of these cases is the reality is we can't stop people from being bad. I mean, these individuals, these sexual abusers, they have different issues, whether it's from their child or whatnot, that they start abusing individuals. And as a society, there's always going to be bad people out there. But what disgusts me the most is these entities that give these abusers unfettered access to young individuals, especially when they knew or should have known about the abuse. These entities have to be held accountable. Certainly the abusers need to be held accountable criminally and civilly. But it breaks my heart when you hear about these organizations that get these reports, whether it's the Boy Scouts or the church or University of Michigan, and they ignore them, they cover them up, they shame the victims, they threaten the victims, they intimidate them. Like Marty shared, they enter into some very, very, very low settlements where they have very challenging confidentiality agreements. So it allows these abusers to continue their behavior because of these aggressive confidentiality agreements. And it's very unfortunate that for so many decades these events went on, and sadly they're still going on today all across the country. My opinion is every entity in university or religious organization has a skeleton, if not skeletons, in the closet. And hopefully with societal changes, with legislative changes, with advocates like Marty and me, we hold these individuals and entities accountable.
Well, and it's why mandatory reporting laws have become so important, right? When somebody suspects abuse in certain situations. That's a good transition, Parker. So you've both a couple of times alluded to statutes of limitations. I think somebody said draconian and outdated, short statutes of limitations that basically create scenarios where by the time a survivor is finally ready to talk about this, their window to seek legal redress for this has now come and passed, and then some. Marty, can you talk a little bit about the efforts nationwide that have been undertaken to fix that problem and give survivors access to the courts so that they can begin to heal and maybe never be made whole, but at least start to get closer to what that might look like through our civil court system?
Absolutely. And this is a topic I feel very strongly about. Our firm represents dozens and dozens of survivors from the Boy Scout cases who were abused by Scout leaders. And we have some of the most egregious types of abuse that happened in, for example, Iowa or, Michigan, where the statute of limitations laws are terrible. And then we have the exact same type of abuse, nearly the same scenario, the same types of notice to the institution in California, New Jersey, or New York. And the values of the cases are significantly less. So why should a victim's, justice be contingent on the geographical location of where they were abused? Especially in the cases where the institutions covered it up and hid it. And there's many cases of this where they knew about it, they shuffled these people around. Nobody knew about all the cover-ups and the concealment until recently. So
what has been done to fix that nationwide?
And so you have states like California that opened a 3-year revival window, which started which closes this year in December 2022. So December 31st is the deadline in which you have to file your claim if you're sexually abused, and the statute of limitations has already expired. You have states like New York that had a 2-year revival window. You had New Jersey had a 2-year revival window. Even in some of the more conservative states like Arkansas and Louisiana, which traditionally, states that were more conservative struggled with passing these types of legislation. Now you're seeing some of those states come around and they're passing revival windows, because at the end of the day, whether you're a conservative or a liberal, I think deep down everybody hates child sexual abuse. Everybody hates child predators, and people are sick of the institutions that covered up for them, even if they were some of the most powerful institutions in your state, whether it was a religious one, if it was a private institution or a prestigious school like University of Michigan. So, there's still many, many states that have to come around. And there's an organization, a nonprofit called Child USA, which Parker and I are members of their junior council. That is it is the leading organization that seeks to change the statute of limitations in a lot of these states. So they got very involved in changing the statute of limitations in Colorado, where Parker can talk about that, but he helped write the legislation there. There's already some communications with them about helping change the statute of limitations in Michigan. And I know they played a pivotal role in the recent legislative changes in Arkansas, where our firm has a number of survivors whom we intend to file suit for shortly.
Parker, we're running a little short on time, but do you want to speak briefly to your lobbying efforts in Colorado to make sure survivors have access to the courts?
Oh, absolutely. So my colleague and I had the privilege of drafting the legislation, working with various legislators and testifying at hearings pertaining to this legislation. And Marty referenced Child USA. Marcy Hamilton, the CEO of that organization, actually testified in Colorado, and she's testified all over the country, including Michigan as well. And one of the things she talks about is the science behind when a child sexual abuse survivor, if they ever come forward, when they do. And it's usually 52, 53 years old, which is well beyond their statute of limitations. And we were successful at passing it in Colorado. January 1st is when it went into effect, and my partner and I filed the first lawsuit against the Denver Diocese. But that being said, more and more states are appreciating it. And the more and more awareness that these states have, like Marty said, it's a bipartisan issue. People hate child sex abuse, and they should.
We're almost out of time. Are there any organizations, you did mention one, are there any organizations, and we're going to run them here for folks at home, are there any organizations for folks who have survived or think they're experiencing this that you can direct people to for help?
So certainly we reference Child USA. RAIN is a national organization that provides a lot of educational material to survivors of sexual abuse, help for sexual abuse survivors, as well as family members, advocates like us. Obviously every single state has a number of different organizations that help. And I know I do, and I know Marty does. We strongly encourage anyone that's gone through this to reach out to the various organizations that are out there. Some of them provide free therapy, like I said, educational material that can really help individuals understand what they went through, how to heal from it, and if they want to explore civil justice or criminal justice, what that looks like.
Well, I want to thank you both. And one more I'll mention that I know you both have talked about is SNAP, I believe is another one. And the links will be running here.
Yeah, the Survivors Network of Those Abused by Priests. And there's also Resilience if you're in the Chicagoland area, which is another great one.
I want to thank you both for your service on behalf of survivors, for advocating and fighting, and for talking about a really difficult topic today in an accessible way to folks at home, for providing these resources to people. I want to encourage anybody watching at home who may think they're experiencing this or has to reach out and get help, because this happens to a lot of people and there is no shame in having survived this. And it's important that there be people advocating for folks like this. Thank you both for joining us today to talk about this. Thank you to everybody at home for watching and listening.
Thank you.
Thanks, Max.